Clara Jensen never thought twice about boarding planes. For her, air travel was as routine as taking the subway downtown. She was a consultant, an aerospace engineer by training, though most people never guessed it. Dressed in her navy cardigan and gray slacks, she blended into the crowd at Denver International Airport like any other business traveler. That morning had been rushed, though not unusual, coffee in hand, laptop tucked away. A few client reports hastily saved to a flash drive. The boarding gate buzzed with chatter as the loudspeaker crackled announcements in the background. The flight to Chicago was only 2 hours, nothing remarkable, just long enough to be inconvenient and short enough to skip planning for. Clara adjusted the strap of her carry-on and glanced around the gate. There was a young family with twin toddlers bouncing restlessly in their seats, a pair of college students whispering over a phone, and a man in a tailored suit pacing back and forth while barking into his Bluetooth headset. Everyone was absorbed in their own bubble of anticipation or impatience, and Clara was no different. She checked her watch. 15 minutes until boarding. Her flight was right on schedule, which was something of a miracle given Denver's winter weather. Outside, the tarmac shimmered with the thin frost of February. An aircraft rumbled in the distance as ground crews moved with well-practiced efficiency. Clara always found airports oddly soothing little worlds of constant motion where no one lingered for long. Strangers' lives intersected briefly, then drifted apart forever. When the announcement came, now boarding Group B for flight 237 to Chicago O'Hare, Clara rose with the others, shuffling forward with quiet patience. She scanned her pass, stepped down the jet bridge, and inhaled that familiar mix of recycled air and engine fuel. Inside the plane, a flight attendant greeted her with a warm smile, directing her toward row 14. Clara slid her carry-on into the overhead bin, tucked her smaller bag beneath the seat, and settled by the window. For a moment, she simply sat still, letting the hum of activity wash over her. Passengers shuffled down the aisle, bumping elbows and muttering apologies. Luggage wheels thudded against armrests. The family with toddlers wrangled their children. A few rows back, while the businessman with the headset argued about quarterly numbers in a low but irritated voice. Clara pulled out her headphones, slipped them on, and pressed play. The low notes of a piano sonata filled her ears. She closed her eyes. Flying had always been comfortable for her, even enjoyable. Unlike many passengers, she didn't tense up at takeoff or clutch the armrest during turbulence. Perhaps it was her background, years spent studying aircraft systems, memorizing schematics, and testing flight simulators during her early engineering career. She had once dreamed of designing the next generation of commercial jets. But somewhere along the way, that passion had been reshaped by the demands of consulting work projects, meetings, deadlines. Travel became routine, stripped of its wonder. Still, she liked this window seat ritual. Watching the ground recede, the sky open up, it always gave her a momentary pause, a reminder of perspective. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. Smooth and professional. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 237. We're scheduled for an on-time departure to Chicago. Weather looks favorable along our route. Estimated flight time is 2 hours and 5 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. Clara smiled faintly. Everything about this felt ordinary, almost comforting in its predictability. Yet beneath that calm surface, she carried a quiet unease, not about the flight, but about life itself. She had been working nonstop for months, traveling from client to client, solving technical puzzles that barely left a mark once her reports were filed away. Her personal life had shrunk around the edges, friendships frayed by constant absence. She often wondered if she was just drifting from city to city, a passenger in her own life as much as in this plane. The engines roared, vibrating through the cabin as the plane began its taxi. Clara leaned her head against the window, watching the runway lights blur past. With a forceful surge, the jet lifted off the ground, pressing her gently back into her seat. For a heartbeat, she closed her eyes, savoring the weightless feeling of ascent. The city below shrank, the Rocky Mountains faded behind them, and the world became an endless stretch of sky. By the time the seatbelt sign switched off, passengers had settled into their small rituals of comfort. Some reached for magazines, others unwrapped snacks. A faint hiss filled the cabin as the air system adjusted, carrying with it the faint smell of coffee brewing in the galley. Clara accepted a can of ginger ale from the flight attendant and sipped quietly, watching the world drift by outside. She studied the patchwork landscape, the low snow-dusted fields and winding rivers, dotted here and there with the geometry of towns and highways. Each glimpse reminded her of how vast the country was, how many lives were unfolding unseen beneath their path. She wondered what stories those scattered houses contained: families gathering for breakfast, mechanics fixing trucks, children chasing each other in backyards. She imagined how strange it must be for them, looking up at the sky and seeing only a tiny silver speck, unaware of the 150 lives cradled inside it. Clara turned her gaze inward. Her mind drifted to her last project, helping a manufacturer troubleshoot faulty avionics modules. She had spent late nights poring over circuit diagrams and test reports, finding the failure points hidden in the maze of wires and code. To most, such work seemed abstract, buried in technical jargon. But to her, it was intimate, like deciphering the pulse of a living organism. Aircraft weren't just machines. They were intricate ecosystems, each system reliant on the other. When one failed, the consequences could ripple in ways no simulation could perfectly capture. The irony was not lost on her. She was sitting here, in row 14, sipping ginger ale, while a complex avionics system, just like the ones she studied, hummed beneath her feet, invisible and taken for granted. Passengers scrolled through phones and flipped pages without a thought to the technology sustaining their weight in the sky. She smiled wryly at that. Most people never thought about what kept a plane in the air. They trusted the engineers, the manufacturers, the maintenance crews, people like her. And why shouldn't they? Commercial flight had become one of the safest modes of travel. Millions flew every day without incident. Still, Clara couldn't help but notice small details. The subtle flicker of the cabin lights when the engines throttled, the faint vibration under her seat, the rhythm of the airflow systems. It wasn't nervousness, just an engineer's instinct, an attunement to patterns. She understood these things in her bones, even when she tried to ignore them. She glanced at her seatmate, a woman in her mid-60s knitting a scarf in soft pastel yarn. The woman caught Clara's eye and smiled. "First time to Chicago?" she asked warmly. "No," Clara replied with a small laugh. "Work trip, you?" "Visiting my daughter," the woman said, her needles clicking steadily. "She just had a baby. First grandchild." Clara offered congratulations, and the woman beamed. They exchanged a few more words before falling into a companionable silence. Clara envied the simplicity of her joy, the clarity of purpose in her journey. As the plane cruised higher, Clara leaned back, headphones still playing softly. She let the music wash over her, losing herself in the rise and fall of notes. She thought about her own mother, about phone calls left too long unanswered, about the life she'd promised herself she'd live, but somehow kept postponing. The plane's steady hum became a kind of lullaby. Around her, the cabin had grown. Quiet passengers absorbed in movies, books, or the rhythm of sleep. Outside the window, sunlight glinted off the wing, painting the clouds in shifting shades of white and silver. It was peaceful, predictable, safe. And yet, beneath that serenity, a thread of tension tugged at her. She didn't know why. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Maybe it was the faint unease that always accompanied her travels. A whisper reminding her that not everything was under human control. For now, she pushed the feeling aside. She was just a passenger, one among many. Her role here was simple: to sit, to wait, to arrive. Nothing more. At least, that was what she believed. The plane climbed smoothly, engines humming in a steady rhythm that filled the cabin with its mechanical heartbeat. To most passengers, it was just background noise, easily tuned out as they reached for magazines or leaned against headrests. But to Clara Jensen, row 14 window seat, the sound was oddly comforting. It was consistent, predictable, like a pulse she could trust. She sipped the last of her ginger ale and set the plastic cup on her tray table. Through the oval window, the world unfolded in endless layers of blue. Below, the ground had already become an abstract quilt. Wide stretches of farmland divided into geometric squares, rivers winding like silver ribbons, tiny towns that looked no larger than dots scattered across a map. She marveled, as she often did, at the scale of it all. Humans were so small, yet they built machines that carried them across continents in hours. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a soft chime. Passengers shifted, stretching their legs, rummaging through bags. A flight attendant rolled a beverage cart down the aisle, the clink of cans and bottles punctuating the cabin's quiet. The businessman across the aisle, still tethered to his Bluetooth headset, groaned audibly about deadlines and muttered something about Q4 projections. A few rows back, one of the twins let out a squeal, followed by the soothing murmur of their mother. Clara leaned back, smiling faintly at the mix of humanity around her. Airplanes were strange microcosms, she thought, 150 strangers sealed into a metal tube, each carrying their own story, intersecting only for this brief shared journey. For the next 2 hours, their fates were tethered together. After that, they would scatter again, resuming lives that would never cross. The woman beside her, the knitter, had made remarkable progress on her pastel scarf. She hummed softly as the needles clicked. Occasionally, she glanced at Clara with a warm, grandmotherly expression, as though silently offering comfort. Clara appreciated it, though she didn't need it. At least, not yet. When the cart reached her row, Clara declined another drink, preferring to keep her mind clear. She took out her tablet instead, flipping through notes on a current project. Lines of diagrams and dense paragraphs filled the screen details about signal interference, redundancies, power routing. She skimmed, half-focused, until her mind drifted elsewhere. Work had become both her anchor and her cage. She loved solving problems, loved tracing failures back to their roots and patching them with elegant solutions. But in recent years, the problems began to feel repetitive, the solutions less rewarding. She was still good at her job, maybe even great, but she couldn't remember the last time it made her feel alive. It was as though she had boarded a career the way she boarded planes, following a ticket someone else had printed for her, buckled in, waiting for a destination she wasn't sure she wanted. She closed the tablet and looked outside again. The horizon stretched endlessly, the sun hanging high and golden above thin layers of cloud. The plane sliced through the sky with serene confidence, wings steady, leaving a faint white contrail. Behind them, there was something deeply humbling in watching the earth from this vantage point. No matter what deadlines or distractions consumed people on the ground, up here it all seemed small, distant, almost irrelevant. A chime drew her attention as the intercom clicked on. The captain's voice, calm and measured, filled the cabin. "Good afternoon, folks. We've reached our cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Smooth conditions ahead for most of the flight, though we may encounter some light chop over Iowa. Nothing unusual. Estimated arrival time in Chicago is 1 hour, 50 minutes. Enjoy the flight." The intercom clicked off, and the cabin settled back into its rhythm. Clara stretched her legs under the seat, adjusting her position. Around her, people had already drifted into routines of comfort. The businessman finally ended his call and buried himself in spreadsheets. A teenager nearby popped in earbuds and nodded his head to the beat of some private soundtrack. A mother pulled out picture books to entertain her restless children. The atmosphere was almost domestic, like a floating living room shared by strangers. People read, snacked, dozed, laughed. The flight attendants moved gracefully between aisles, their practiced smiles never faltering. Even the steady vibration of the engines became part of this temporary home, a reminder that everything was working exactly as it should. For most passengers, it was easy to forget that flying was a miracle, but Clara could never forget. Her eyes lingered on the wing outside, studying the slight flecks in the metal as the plane adjusted to invisible air currents. She thought about the millions of calculations that went into designing such a structure, the precise balance of strength and flexibility, the countless tests, the simulations. She imagined the fuel pumps humming, the sensors measuring, the computers coordinating endless variables in real time. She knew, intimately, how fragile it all could be if even one system faltered. It didn't scare her. On the contrary, it fascinated her. But she knew better than most how easily routine could become rupture. Her seatmate's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the older woman said, glancing at the window. Clara smiled. "It really is. You'd think after all these years, people would stop being amazed at it," the woman continued. "But I never do. Every time, it feels like a little miracle." Clara nodded, her smile softening. "That's a good way to see it," the woman chuckled. "And yet most folks just complain about legroom." They both laughed quietly, and Clara found herself relaxing. A small turbulence bump jostled the cabin, and several passengers instinctively stiffened. Drinks rippled in their cups. Clara didn't flinch. Her body recognized the rhythm, just normal air pockets, nothing unusual. But she noticed how quickly fear rose in the people around her, how instinctively they tensed when reminded that they were not in control. That, she thought, was the paradox of air travel. People placed their lives entirely in the hands of unseen experts, trusting pilots and engineers and crews they would never meet. Most of the time, it was fine, safe, efficient, even boring. But trust was fragile, and when disrupted, fear spread faster than smoke. She pushed the thought away. For now, everything was calm again. The plane leveled smoothly, and passengers relaxed. Clara reached for her bag and pulled out a notebook, scribbling a few ideas for an upcoming meeting. But her focus wandered. Her pen doodled patterns instead of words, wings, circuits, little sketches of planes. She caught herself and sighed. Why did she feel so restless lately? Her job paid well. Her career was respectable. But somewhere, she felt adrift, as though she was coasting at cruising altitude without any real destination. She remembered the girl she had once been, wide-eyed, ambitious, dreaming of building machines that changed the future. When had she stopped chasing that? She closed the notebook and stared at the clouds. Around her, the cabin was quiet again, punctuated by small human sounds, the whisper of pages turning, the low murmur of voices, the occasional cough. It was ordinary. So ordinary. And yet, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the stillness was fragile, like the hush before a storm. At first, it was subtle, so subtle Clara thought she might have imagined it. A faint shudder rippled through the fuselage, a barely perceptible tremor beneath her shoes. The engines, usually a steady hum, wavered for the briefest second before, regaining rhythm, Most passengers didn't notice. A businessman beside the aisle continued typing furiously on his laptop. The children in row 16 giggled at a cartoon playing on a tablet. Even the knitting needles of her seatmate clicked. Without pause, but Clara noticed. She always noticed. Her eyes shifted to the overhead panel, where the reading lights flickered once, twice then, steadied again. To most, it would look like nothing more than a power hiccup, the kind that happened in any building. But on a plane at 34,000 feet, such flickers told a different story. She inhaled slowly, forcing calm. Another bump shook the aircraft, sharper this time. Soda cans rattled on tray tables. Someone gasped. A toddler began to whimper, quickly soothed by his mother's gentle pat. A voice from the back said, too loudly, "That's not normal, is it?" Laughter followed, thin and nervous. The flight attendant nearest to Clara smiled brightly, her training evident. "Just a little turbulence, folks. Perfectly normal at this altitude." Her tone was smooth, practiced. But her knuckles whitened slightly against the beverage carts. Handle. Clara caught the detail, small but telling. She pressed her palm flat against the armrest, feeling for the rhythm of the engines. Something was off. The cadence was uneven now, as though one system were struggling to keep pace. And then came the smell. It was faint at first, sharp and acrid, threading through the conditioned air. Clara knew it, instantly burnt wiring, the scent of overheating electrical systems. She had spent years hunched over test rigs that smelled just like this, watching circuits overload under stress. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't the only one to notice. A man across the aisle wrinkled his nose. "Do you smell that?" he asked his wife, who frowned and nodded. Soon, murmurs rippled through the cabin. People sniffed the air, exchanged uneasy glances. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice, usually smooth, now carried a strain beneath its calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical issue. Nothing to be alarmed about, but we'll be taking some precautionary measures. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened until further notice." Clara's pulse quickened. She had heard enough of these announcements in her life to know the subtext. Minor technical issue rarely meant minor. The captain's words were a soft blanket laid over hard edges. The knitting woman beside her shifted uneasily. "Oh dear," she murmured, clutching her scarf. Clara offered what she hoped was a reassuring smile, though her own thoughts raced. She wanted to say something, to explain, but stopped herself. What could she say that wouldn't cause more fear? Another jolt hit the plane, this one sharper, accompanied by a metallic groan that echoed through the cabin. Overhead bins rattled. A few gasps turned into shouts. The seatbelt sign blinked on, followed by the ding of compliance. Flight attendants moved quickly, securing loose items, their smiles stretched thin. Clara pressed her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. Briefly, she tried to piece together what could be happening. Electrical smell, flickering lights, uneven engine hum. The possibilities raced through her mind. A failing generator, a bus fault in the avionics system, perhaps a cascading failure between redundancies. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the combination was wrong, very wrong. The plane lurched again, dropping a few feet in a sudden pocket of turbulence. Passengers cried out, one woman clutching the arm of the stranger beside her. A soda quintupled, fizzing across the aisle. The baby in row 16 began to wail, the sound sharp and piercing. Clara forced her breathing steady, clinging to the methodical calm she used in labs and workshops. Observe, analyze, don't panic. She opened her eyes and studied the cabin. Fear was spreading now, subtle but undeniable. Passengers shifted uneasily. Whispers grew louder. eyes darted to the crew for reassurance. And always, in the background, that faint but unmistakable scent of burning electrics. The intercom clicked again. The captain's voice was firmer now, but not unshaken. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered an electrical malfunction, affecting some of our onboard systems. We are working to resolve it. At this time, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." Gasps, questions. A voice demanded, "What does that mean?" Another called out, "Are we safe?" The attendants moved swiftly, voices calm but clipped as they urged passengers to stay calm. But Clara could feel the shift. The illusion of ordinary routine had cracked. The cabin no longer felt like a floating living room. It felt like a trap. Her own thoughts turned darker. She knew how planes were designed, how redundancies were built into redundancies. But she also knew that no system was infallible. And when things failed at 34,000 feet, stakes weren't measured in inconvenience. They were measured in lives. The woman beside her clutched her knitting tighter. "You're calm," she whispered to Clara. "How are you so calm?" Clara hesitated. What could she say? That she recognized the signs, that she knew what burning insulation meant, that she could map out possible failure chains in her head. Like a grim puzzle? That she was only calm because panic would cloud her judgment. Instead, she said softly, "I fly often. Things like this, they can look scarier than they are." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The lights flickered again, longer this time. The cabin dimmed and surged back to brightness. A child whimpered. The businessman across the aisle slammed his laptop shut, muttering curses under his breath. Clara's chest tightened. This wasn't turbulence. This wasn't routine. Something fundamental was unraveling. And though no one else knew it yet, though they sat buckled in their seats, clinging to reassurances, Clara felt the weight of certainty press down on her. This flight was in trouble. And somehow, she knew she wouldn't remain just a passenger for long. The cockpit of Flight 237 was normally a place of calm routine, a domain where order ruled above all else. Captain Robert Hayes had logged over 12,000 flight hours, and his first officer, Melissa Grant, was sharp, methodical, and steady. Under pressure, together, they had guided hundreds of flights across skies both turbulent and smooth. But as the warning chimes began to layer one over another, filling the small space with shrill urgency, calm gave way to chaos. A red light blinked on the central panel. Elite Cassie's fault. Moments later, another illuminated. Then another. The screens that displayed navigation data flickered, glitching as though caught in a strobe. Melissa's fingers flew across the switches, trying resets, running through the checklist. "Bus 2's down," she reported, her voice clipped, professional. "Power is unstable. Switching to auxiliary." Captain Hayes adjusted the controls, but the yoke resisted, sluggish. The plane shuddered against his command. "I've got partial control, but she's fighting me." Melissa's brow furrowed as she checked the secondary display. "Environmental systems are compromised. We've got bleed pressure dropping on the left side. Focus on flight critical systems," Hayes ordered, his jaw tight. "Avionics first. Keep us navigable." She nodded, reaching for the circuit breakers. Sparks of static hissed across one screen before it died completely. Melissa muttered, "That's not good." The intercom chimed softly in the background, the flight attendants calling to check in. Hayes ignored it for the moment, his focus split between keeping the aircraft steady and parsing which systems were still alive. Every second brought a new piece of bad news. Electrical problems were never simple. Planes weren't like cars. You couldn't just pull over when the dashboard lit up. The electrical grid of a jet was a complex web, each system feeding into another, redundancies designed to protect against single points of failure. But when multiple points failed at once, the web frayed dangerously. Hayes glanced at his co-pilot. She was pale, but her hands moved quickly, flipping switches, monitoring readouts. She was good, he reminded himself. Calm under fire. But even she couldn't mask the tightness in her breathing. Rebooting the navigation suite, Melissa sighed. She tapped keys, waited. The screen flickered back to life, then went black again. Hayes muttered under his breath. Damn it. The autopilot disengaged with a loud chime, the wheel jerking slightly. Hayes gripped it hard. Manual control. His knuckles whitened as he steadied the aircraft. External comms are unstable, Melissa reported after another 30 seconds of scanning. I can't guarantee we'll maintain radio. Hayes cursed again. Losing comms at 34,000 feet was a nightmare. Air traffic control needed updates. They needed vectors. Without them, they were flying half-blind. He toggled the intercom switch, forcing his voice steady. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're experiencing an electrical malfunction, affecting some of our systems. We're trained for this, and we're working through procedures. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. He clicked off before his tone betrayed how serious it was. Melissa whispered, Captain, redundancy should have covered this. 2 generators can't fail like this. Hayes didn't respond right away. He thought of the passengers just behind the doormen, women, children, all of them trusting him. Without question, the weight pressed heavy. In the cabin, Clara caught fragments of the situation through body language and tone. The captain's announcement, though measured, had the same cadence she had heard in engineers, giving half-truths during test failures. It was designed to calm, but it carried tension beneath the words. She leaned back, but her mind raced with possibilities. Her instincts screamed that the situation was unraveling fast. Back in the cockpit, Hayes and Melissa worked side by side, attempting cross-tie from generator 1 to bus 2. Melissa said, fingers flying. Sparks spat from a panel. Both flinched. Negative, Hayes barked. Kill that. Kill it. Melissa yanked the switch down, cutting the connection. The sparking ceased, leaving only the shrill alarms. Sweat trickled down the side of her face. We're running on limited battery backup now, she said grimly. That gives us, she checked, about 30 minutes if we don't shed load. Hayes exhaled slowly. 30 minutes of partial systems. 30 minutes to find a solution. Or a runway. The radio crackled faintly, a TC's voice breaking through with static. Flight 237. Reading you intermittent? Confirmed status? Melissa leaned into the mic. Denver Center. Flight 237 experiencing electrical failure. Request vectors to nearest suitable. Static swallowed the reply. The green comms light blinked erratically. Hayes forced himself to focus. Nearest alternate? Melissa flipped a paper chart, the old-fashioned backup. With digital displays failing, she resorted to analog. Her finger traced across. Lincoln. Regional 120 miles east. Runways short but viable. Hayes considered. With unreliable systems, every extra mile was a risk. But O'Hare was too far. Lincoln might be their only chance. He nodded. Plot course. Let's keep this bird in the air. Back in the cabin, the passengers felt the tremors of decisions they couldn't hear. Another jolt rippled through the fuselage. The lights dimmed, then steadied. Nervous voices rose in waves, punctuated by questions. What's happening? Are we safe? Why aren't they telling us more? The flight attendants walked quickly, faces composed but tight. They reassured where they could, hushed frightened children, handed out water with smiles that didn't quite reach there. Eyes. Clara sat still, her senses tuned to every flicker and vibration. She wasn't panicking, but she wasn't calm either. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a storm, watching clouds twist into unnatural shapes. She could read the signs, even if no one else could. Inside the cockpit, the situation worsened. "Captain," Melissa said, her voice tense. "We're losing hydraulic pressure on System A." Hayes swallowed hard. That system powered the primary controls. Without it, flying the plane became a battle of brute force. "How long?" he asked. "Minutes, maybe less." For a moment, silence fell in the cockpit, broken only by the relentless beeping of alarms. Hayes stared at the horizon through the windshield. The sky looked calm, almost beautiful, but inside the plane, the storm was raging. He thought again of the people behind the door, the trust in their eyes as they boarded, the unspoken contract that he would deliver them safely. He clenched the yoke tighter. Failure was not an option, but neither was denial. He needed help, and though he didn't know it yet, the help he needed was sitting quietly in row 14, her mind already working faster than most systems, still alive on his dashboard. Clara sat rigidly in her seat as the tension in the cabin thickened. The air smelled faintly metallic now. An undercurrent of heat and smoke threaded into the sterile flow of recycled oxygen. Around her, panic bloomed in small, uneven burst snippets of whispered speculation, nervous laughter, frantic questions tossed toward flight attendants who were running out of reassurances. The knitting woman beside her gripped her scarf so tightly that the yarn stretched taut. "I don't like this," she whispered. Her voice trembled, fragile. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Clara hesitated. She wanted to say no. She wanted to offer the same gentle lies the crew was giving. "It's fine. Just turbulence. Nothing to worry about." But she couldn't bring herself to say it. She wasn't wired that way. She knew too much. She could see the pattern forming, the way a chess player could see 3 moves ahead. Something vital was failing. And if the crew couldn't stabilize it soon, they'd be in serious danger. Her eyes flicked to the flight attendants. One of them, a young man with neatly combed hair and a strained smile, stood near the galley with a phone pressed to his ear, speaking in hushed tones with the cockpit. His face gave him away. The tight jaw, the forced calm, the way his fingers tapped anxiously against the wall as he listened. When he hung up, another attendant whispered to him, her face pale. He nodded grimly, then straightened, pasting his professional smile back on before stepping into the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, everything is under control," he said, voice smooth but hollow. "The pilots are working through standard procedures. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The words rang false. Clara could feel the lie vibrating in her bones. The passengers sensed it. 2 murmurs of doubt rose instantly. Clara's heart pounded. She wasn't the type to volunteer herself into the spotlight. She hated drawing attention. At conferences, she preferred the back rows. At meetings, she let her reports speak for her. But this was different. The stakes weren't theoretical. The smell of burnt wiring wasn't a line in a test report. It was right here, in the air. She was breathing. She remembered the years she had spent in labs, running diagnostics on avionics systems. Hours of testing for faults, rerouting power flows, analyzing points of failure. She had seen scenarios like this in simulations, alarms cascading, redundancies collapsing, time slipping away like sand through fingers. And she had solved them. The difference was, those simulations didn't come with 150 lives on the line. She chewed her lip, pulse quickening. If she stayed silent, she was just another passenger waiting to be saved or not. If she spoke up, she risked looking foolish, intrusive, even hysterical. The pilots were professionals. They didn't need random passengers barging in with opinions. And yet, She knew she might be the only one on board who truly understood what was happening behind that locked cockpit door. The businessman across the aisle muttered darkly, "What the hell's going on up there? We paid for tickets, not Russian roulette." His voice was louder than he intended, carrying across several rows. A ripple of unease followed. Passengers glanced at each other, eyes wide, searching for reassurance and finding none. Clara clenched her fists. She could feel the moment slipping past, the choice pressing harder with each second. If she stayed quiet, regret would eat her alive. Her seatmate touched her arm, voice quivering. "You seem so calm," she whispered. "Why? Do you know something?" Clara turned to her slowly. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she exhaled and nodded once. "I'm an aerospace engineer," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only the older woman could hear. What's happening right now, it's my field. I think I can help." The woman's eyes widened. Relief and surprise mingled in her expression. She squeezed Clara's arm tightly, whispering, "Then you must tell them." The words struck like a spark to dry tinder. Clara's hesitation burned away. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The simple click echoed louder than it should have. Several heads turned as she stood in the narrow aisle, clutching the back of her seat for balance as the plane shuddered again. One of the flight attendants noticed immediately and hurried over. "Ma'am, please remain seated," he said firmly, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. Clara steadied her voice. "I'm not trying to cause trouble, but I overheard your cockpit is dealing with electrical failures, isn't it?" The attendant froze. His professional mask flickered. He recovered quickly, but the crack was visible. "Ma'am, that information is, I'm an aerospace engineer," Clara interrupted, louder now, her voice carrying over the anxious murmurs. "Avionics systems. I've worked with electrical buses and flight control redundancies. I know what those smells and flickers mean. I can help." The words landed like a stone dropped into a pond. Ripples of silence spread instantly. Dozens of eyes turned toward her, some desperate, some skeptical, all wide with tension. The flight attendant blinked, clearly at a loss. He glanced back toward the galley, as though hoping a supervisor would materialize and tell him what to do. From behind, another attendant whispered urgently, "Get her to the cockpit." The first shook his head. "We can't. We don't have a choice," the second hissed. "You heard the captain. They're running out of time." Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. For a moment, she thought they might dismiss her, shove her back into her seat, dismiss her claim as panic. But the first attendant finally nodded, swallowing hard. "Come with me," he said. As Clara followed him down the aisle, passengers watched in silence, their fear etched clearly on their faces. Some looked hopeful, others doubtful, but all of them stared, as though she carried the weight of their survival in her small frame. She didn't look like a savior. She wasn't in uniform. She had no badge or authority. She was just another traveler with tired eyes and a laptop bag. And yet, at that moment, she became something else in their eyes, an answer to a question none of them could voice. At the cockpit door, the attendant lifted the phone and spoke quickly to the pilots. He kept glancing at Clara as he explained, his voice urgent. After a tense exchange, the heavy door buzzed and clicked open. The attendant looked at her with a mixture of fear and hope. "They'll hear you out," he said. Clara stepped forward, her legs trembling slightly, and crossed the threshold into the cockpit. She had boarded this plane as nobody. But now, every life on board might depend on whether she was somebody after all. The cockpit of Flight 237 felt smaller than Clara expected. A cramped metal chamber filled with alarms that screamed and lights that pulsed angrily across panels. The air was hot, tinged with ozone and burnt wiring. She hesitated at the threshold. For a heartbeat, overwhelmed by the noise, the flickering screens, and the raw tension radiating from the two pilots in their seats. Captain Hayes glanced over his shoulder. His square jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. His uniform shirt was damp with sweat, his knuckles white as he gripped the yoke. Beside him, First Officer Melissa Grant was bent over her console, her eyes darting between failing readouts as she ran through emergency procedures with the speed of someone trying to outrace disaster. "What's she doing here?" Hayes barked at the flight attendant, his voice sharp with authority. "She says she's an aerospace engineer," the attendant blurted. "Avionics experience." Hayes gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Fantastic. Another passenger who thinks they can fly the plane." Clara swallowed, forcing herself to steady her voice. "I don't think I can fly the plane, but I know what your systems are doing. I've worked on aircraft buses, hydraulic redundancies, electrical routing. I know those alarms, Captain. They're telling me you're losing more than backup. They're telling me your load shedding won't hold." Melissa looked up sharply. Her eyes flicked to Hayes, then back to Clara. "How do you know that?" Clara's pulse thudded in her ears, but she kept her words precise. "Because I've watched this exact failure chain in testing simulations. When bus 2 shorts while generator 1 is unstable, the load shifts unevenly. You'll get 30 minutes of partial power at best, but hydraulics will bleed out long before that." "The autopilot is already dead, isn't it?" Melissa froze. Hayes's hand tightened on the yoke. The silence between them was louder than the alarms. "Who are you?" Melissa asked. "Clara Jennings, systems engineer. I used to work for Avidyne Aerospace. We built these fault tree analyzes into certification trials. I know how this goes." For the first time, Hayes's steely mask cracked. His eyes narrowed, evaluating her. "And what's your miracle fix, Miss Jennings? Because unless you've got a spare generator in that purse of yours, we're running out of sky." Clara inhaled sharply, grounding herself in the reality she knew. "Don't panic. Think like a system." She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the panels. "You've still got generator 2 feeding partial, but your cross ties are unstable. If we try to force a full reroute, you risk arcing the entire bus. But if you stagger the load and isolate hydraulics to priority channels only," Hayes cut her off with a scowl. "We've already run the checklist. Standard procedure doesn't allow. Standard procedure won't save you." Clara snapped before she could stop herself. The words rang against the metal walls. For a moment, all three stared at her. Hayes's face darkened, but Melissa spoke first, her voice quiet. "She's right, Captain. The checklist doesn't account for dual generator instability. If we do nothing, hydraulics will fail completely in minutes." The cockpit trembled as another shudder passed through the plane. Hayes fought the controls, gritting his teeth. "So what do you suggest, engineer?" Clara leaned forward, her finger tracing across the schematic panel. "You stagger load. Shut down all non-essential avionics, lighting, galley, even passenger. Oxygen pumps for now. Feed hydraulics directly from generator 2 with a manual override. It buys you time, maybe not much, but enough to reach Lincoln Regional." Hayes glared at her. He was a man used to control, to authority unchallenged. Taking advice from a civilian was anathema to him. But beneath his pride was something heavier, the knowledge that she might be right. Melissa looked at him, urgency in her voice. "Captain, if she's right and we don't try, we lose control surfaces. Completely." Another alarm blared. He'd press a low. Hayes's jaw worked. He stared at Clara, then back at his instruments. "Fine," he muttered. "Do it." Melissa's hands moved quickly, flipping switches with precision, shedding non-essential systems. One by one, cabin lights dimmed further. The faint hum of ventilation weakened. Passengers behind the locked door would feel the change instantly. Clara guided her. Stagger the load. Don't reroute all at once. You'll overload the bus. Give it 5-second intervals. Melissa obeyed, counting softly under her breath. One by one, systems clicked offline. The cockpit grew darker, lit only by the sickly glow of failing screens. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the hydraulic pressure gauge steadied, ticking upward a fraction. It's holding, Melissa whispered, her eyes wide. Hydraulics are stabilizing. Hayes let out a long, shaky breath. His grip on the yoke eased fractionally. He glanced at Clara again, his expression unreadable. You've bought us time, he said. The words were grudging, but they carried weight. Clara exhaled in relief, though her hands were still trembling. Time is all we need. But you'll have to fly it manual the whole way. Hayes gave a dry laugh. Lady, I was flying manual before you were born. That part one can handle. The tension in the cockpit shifted. It wasn't gone. The crisis was far from over, but the balance had tipped. Survival no longer felt impossible. Melissa turned to Clara. Can you stay? If we lose another system, we'll need your insight. Clara hesitated. She wasn't trained for this role. She wasn't supposed to be here, shoulder to shoulder with pilots in the crucible of command. But walking away wasn't an option. She nodded. I'll stay. The next hour stretched taut as wire. Clara worked alongside the pilots, scanning readouts, suggesting load distributions, keeping the fragile balance alive. Hayes remained curt, his words clipped, but he no longer dismissed her outright. Melissa treated her like a colleague, their exchanges quick, precise, technical. Behind the cockpit door, passengers waited in frightened silence, unaware that their survival now hinged on an unplanned partnership. A reluctant captain, a steady first officer, and a passenger who had stepped into a role she never sought. Clara never imagined herself leading in a crisis like this. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She didn't have stripes on her shoulder. And yet every decision she made carried lives in its wake. It wasn't authority. She felt it was responsibility. And it was heavier than anything she had ever known. The cockpit was a furnace of tension. Dim emergency lights cast long shadows across the panels, most of them either dead or blinking with angry red warnings. Outside the windshield, the endless blackness of night stretched like an ocean, stars faint against the void. The plane rumbled and shuddered, every vibration a reminder that they were flying on borrowed time. Clara wiped her palms against her jeans, her mouth dry. Her gaze moved between Captain Hayes's iron grip on the yoke and First Officer Melissa's. Frantic coordination with air traffic control. Every second brought them closer to the point of no return. We've got one chance, Hayes muttered, voice gravelly. His eyes were locked forward, scanning the darkness as though sheer willpower could summon a runway from it. Lincoln Regional's the nearest strip long enough. But with hydraulics this week, he trailed off, shaking his head. Melissa's voice was steadier, though her hands trembled as she adjusted dials. A TC says weather's clear. They've cleared the field. Emergency crews standing by. Hayes snorted softly. They'll be pulling bodies if we botch this. Clara's chest tightened. She forced herself to focus on facts, not fear. The hydraulics are holding, but only just. If you keep control movements minimal, you'll make it. Don't fight. The plane guided. Think of it like coaxing a wounded animal. Hayes shot her a sidelong glance. For the first time, there was something almost like respect in his eyes. Not bad advice for a passenger. Clara met his gaze evenly. I stopped being just a passenger an hour ago. Melissa cut in, her tone brisk. We're 20 minutes. Out. Start descent profile. Hayes adjusted the throttles. The engines groaned in protest as the nose dipped slightly downward. The plane shivered again, as though resisting. Clara's stomach dropped with the shift. Behind the locked door, she imagined the passengers clutching their armrests, whispering prayers, staring wide-eyed into the darkness. The descent began. At first, it was almost smooth. Hayes's hands were steady, his breathing controlled. But soon, the plane bucked like a wild horse. With hydraulics faltering, the controls responded sluggishly, delayed by seconds. Every adjustment felt exaggerated, overcorrected, as if the aircraft itself resented being steered. "Easy," Clara murmured, more to herself than to Hayes. "Small inputs. Don't chase it." Hayes grunted, fighting the yoke. "You want the seat, engineer?" "No," Clara said firmly. "You've got the skill. I'll keep you balanced." Melissa relayed altitude readings, her voice quick but precise. "Descending through 9,000. Rate of descent unstable. Watch it, Captain. The nose dipped too far. Alarms blaring." Hayes hauled back, his teeth bared. The plane lurched upward, passengers screaming faintly audible through the bulkhead. Clara leaned forward. "Don't overpull. Ease it. Let it settle." Hayes exhaled hard, following her advice. Slowly, the nose steadied. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat dripped down Hayes's temple. Melissa's voice was a lifeline, calling out numbers, speed, altitude, headings. Clara scanned the systems panel, her eyes darting across the remaining gauges. She called out anomalies before they could spiral. Fuel feed unstable. Compensate with right engine. Pressures bleeding. Again retrim. Hydraulics priority. They became a strange team. Pilot, co-pilot, and the reluctant engineer who had once boarded only as a passenger. Each voice mattered. Each decision threaded them closer to survival. "Lincoln in sight," Melissa said suddenly, relief breaking through her tone. Through the windshield, Clara saw it too, a thin ribbon of light piercing the darkness. Runway beacons glowing faintly on the horizon. Her breath caught. It was real. A destination. A chance. But with it came new terror. The hardest part was still ahead. "Landing gear," Hayes barked. Melissa hesitated. "Hydraulics may not deploy them." "We don't land belly up if we can help it," Hayes snapped. Clara interjected quickly. "If the gear jams halfway, it'll shear on impact. Try manual crank first, slower, but safer." Hayes glared, but nodded. "Do it." Melissa reached for the manual override, cranking with effort. The cockpit filled with the grinding groan of stubborn machinery. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. Then thunk. "Main gear locked," Melissa announced. "Nose gear. Wait. Still not down." Clara's stomach turned. A partial gear landing was a nightmare scenario. "You'll drag the nose if it doesn't lock." Hayes's jaw tightened. "Then we hold it off as long as we can?" The runway lights loomed larger, clearer now. The plane dropped lower, every vibration amplified. 2,000 feet, Melissa said, her voice taut. "Speed's high," Hayes grimaced. "Flaps?" Melissa shook her head. "Not enough hydraulics. Minimal extension only." Clara's mind raced. "Then keep your approach shallow. Bleed. Speed with drag. Use the gear as your brake." The engines throttled back, a deep roar fading to a growl. The plane's nose trembled, resisting every correction. "Final approach," Melissa said, her tone clipped. Clara gripped the seat back behind her, knuckles white. She forced herself to breathe, to trust. The runway rushed toward them. Hayes's focus was absolute, his hands steady despite the sweat dripping down his face. "Easy," he muttered, as if coaxing the aircraft itself. "Come on, sweetheart. Hold together. 100 feet. The plane bucked. Hayes fought, Clara shouting over the alarms. "Ease, don't fight, let it settle." 50 feet. The Runway lights blurred in Clara's vision. Passengers screamed faintly beyond the door. 20 feet. The main wheels hit the ground with a bone-jarring slam. The cabin shook violently. Sparks flew as rubber screeched against asphalt. Hayes held the nose aloft, muscles straining, the yoke trembling under his grip. For a breathless few seconds, the plane thundered forward, nose still in the air. But hydraulics bled out. The nose sagged. Clara shouted, "Brace!" The nose struck with a deafening crash, metal shrieking. Sparks exploded in a cascade. The aircraft skidded, screaming against the runway. The cabin rattled, overhead bins spilling, passengers crying out in terror. Hayes wrestled the yoke, keeping the aircraft centered. Melissa called out speed numbers, her voice shaking but controlled. Clara braced herself, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane slowed, screeching to a halt in a cloud of smoke and sparks. Silence fell, broken, only by the faint hiss of settling metal. For a moment, no one moved. The world was still. Then, faintly, the sound of applause began, passengers sobbing and clapping from behind the door. Hayes slumped in his seat, chest heaving. Melissa's hands trembled as she set down her headset. Clara leaned against the wall, her legs weak, tears stinging her eyes. They had done it. Somehow, impossibly, they had landed. The silence after the landing was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved. The passengers sat frozen, wide-eyed, their hands still locked on armrests, as if the slightest shift might cause the crippled aircraft to lurch again. In the cockpit, Clara's ears rang from the metallic screech, still echoing in her memory. Smoke drifted faintly through the vents, acrid and sharp, the smell of scorched rubber and metal grinding. Then, all at once, sound rushed back. People sobbed, others shouted prayers of thanks. Someone laughed high and broken, but alive. A ripple of applause swelled through the cabin, building into a roar of clapping and cheers. They had survived the impossible. Captain Hayes exhaled a ragged breath, his hands finally releasing the yoke he had clung to with white knuckles. His shoulders sagged, every ounce of strength drained. Melissa leaned back in her seat, her head set askew. Eyes glistening with tears, she quickly blinked away. Clara pressed her palms against the cool bulkhead, grounding herself. Her knees wobbled, but she remained upright. She hadn't flown the plane, not exactly, but without her, it would have gone down in flames. That realization weighed heavily, a mix of pride and disbelief. Hayes turned slowly to her. His face was pale, jaw set, but his eyes held something. New respect. "You saved us," he said simply. No sarcasm. No dismissal. Just truth. Clara shook her head, voice hoarse. "We saved us together." Melissa reached out, placing a trembling hand on Clara's arm. "Don't downplay it. You knew what we didn't. You gave us time. That's the only reason we're sitting here." Instead of, she trailed off, swallowing hard. The cockpit door creaked open. A flight attendant's tear-streaked face appeared. "Captain, passengers are panicking. Emergency crews are outside." Hayes nodded wearily. "Start evacuation. Procedures. We'll follow." The evacuation was chaotic, but orderly. Passengers slid down inflatable chutes into the cool night air, voices raised in disbelief and gratitude. Emergency vehicles ringed the runway, red and blue lights flashing against the dark. Firefighters sprayed foam around the landing gear, wary of sparks igniting a blaze. Clara followed the stream of passengers, her shoes hitting the tarmac with a jolt. She looked up at the plane, the enormous metal body scarred and smoking, nose dented, wheels still steaming. It looked broken, battered, yet it stood upright, victorious in its survival. For a moment, Clara just stared. chest tightening. That machine should have been her tomb. Instead, it was a miracle. Reporters had already begun gathering at the perimeter, cameras flashing. Rumors must have spread quickly. Emergency landing, near disaster, miraculous survival. Microphones pointed like weapons at stunned passengers, who stumbled into the chaos of flashing bulbs and shouted questions. Was it terrifying? How did the pilot save you? Did you think you were going to die? Clara tried to move past unnoticed, but passengers began pointing toward her. A man in his 40s with a tear-streaked face shouted, "That's her. She was in the cockpit. She helped them land." Heads turned, eyes locked onto her. The crowd surged. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved inches from her face. "Ma'am, is it true you assisted the pilots? What exactly did you do?" Clara raised her hands, overwhelmed. "Please, this isn't about me. The pilots." But the crowd pressed harder, hungry for the story. "You're an engineer, correct? Did you override the systems? Did you save the flight?" Before Clara could answer, Hayes and Melissa appeared behind her, uniforms rumpled, exhaustion etched into every line of their faces. Hayes raised a hand, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "She's the reason we're alive," he declared. "This woman, Clara Jennings, kept this plane in the air when systems failed. She gave us solutions when even training couldn't. Don't ask if she helped. Without her, there'd be nothing left to report." The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed furiously. Shouts of admiration and disbelief echoed through the night. Clara's cheeks flushed hot, her pulse racing. She wanted to shrink back, to disappear into anonymity. She hadn't done this for recognition. She had done it because she couldn't stand by and let people die. Yet here she was, thrust into a spotlight brighter than any she had ever imagined. Over the next hours, chaos blurred into surreal fragments. Paramedics checked her vitals. Passengers approached in waves, hugging her, thanking her through tears. A mother pressed Clara's hands between hers, whispering, "You saved my children. I'll never forget this." An elderly man clasped her shoulder firmly, his eyes shining. "You gave us all another chance." Each word struck deep. Gratitude was humbling, but also crushing. Clara wasn't sure how to carry the weight of so many lives. By dawn, national news outlets had picked up the story. "Miracle landing in Nebraska," headlines screamed. Photos of Clara circulated disheveled, exhausted, her eyes wide in shock. Strangers called her a hero. She returned home days later to find reporters camped outside her apartment, neighbors gawking with awe. Messages poured into her inbox, old colleagues, strangers, even government officials. Some offered jobs, others asked for interviews. The FAA requested her presence for debriefing. Clara felt like she was living someone else's life. She had boarded that plane as nobody special, just another face in the crowd. Now she was a household name. At first, she resisted. She avoided interviews, shied away from cameras. She told friends, "I didn't save that plane alone. I don't want credit for something that was teamwork." But the truth was undeniable. She had stepped into the cockpit when everyone else had frozen. She had spoken when silence would have meant death. She had carried knowledge into action. And slowly, Clara began to accept it. Weeks later, she stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., a medal of commendation heavy in her hands. Government officials praised her courage, her expertise under pressure. Hayes and Melissa stood beside her, both smiling proudly. When it was her turn to speak, Clara's voice trembled at first. She looked out at the audience, politicians, reporters, survivors of Flight 237, and took a deep breath. "I never asked to be a hero," she began. "I was just a passenger. But when the moment came, I couldn't ignore what I knew. I couldn't stay silent while lives were at stake. The truth is, every one of us is capable of more than we believe when the moment demands it. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about stepping forward despite fear. That's all I did. And I hope if anyone here ever finds themselves in an impossible moment, they'll do the same. The room rose in a standing ovation. Clara blinked back tears, the weight of applause crashing over her. In that instant, she realized the plane hadn't just changed her, it had revealed her. She wasn't simply an engineer. She wasn't just a passenger. She was someone who could carry responsibility when it mattered most. Later that night, as she walked alone beneath the quiet Washington stars, Clara tilted her head upward. She thought of the sky, of the black void that had nearly claimed her, of the broken machine that had fought to survive. She whispered into the night, "I was only a passenger," until the plane broke down. And now, I'll never be just a passenger again. Her journey wasn't over. Life would move forward, full of new challenges and unknown skies. But whatever came, she carried with her the knowledge that when disaster struck, she had risen not just for herself, but for everyone. The world would remember Flight 237 as a miracle. Clara would remember it as the moment she discovered who she truly was. And that was a story that would never fade.